Welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom. Thanks for joining us today. Your hosts are myself, David Hamovich, and Nick Godfrey, both within Google Cloud's Office of the CISO. You can find and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So Nick, today's guest is Don Callahan.
That's right, David. Don is a hugely respected leader in both financial services and the technology industry. He also sits on the boards of WEX, Scotiabank and Solace. And of course, Don is also a member of Google Cloud's Executive Advisory Board.
Yep, and I know Don has also led successful tech and operational transformations during his time in the financial services sector as well. So let's get right to the discussion. Okay, Don, welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom. So today we're going to talk about the constant influx of new technology, because I think the boards are really facing a real challenge here, separating kind of the hype from what is truly transformational. So I'm just curious, thinking back over your career, is there a certain example, and if not one time, perhaps more broadly, where you saw a company truly transform how it does business with new technology while fulfilling their long-term objectives?
Yeah, well, David, let me start by saying it's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking with you, particularly about new technologies and cyber. And your first question is over my career. What I think you wanted to say it was over my very long career, right? Because I grew up, as you may know, in IBM, and I learned the compute model early on. I had the luxury of growing up in the mainframe world, and then I was asked to work on helping to launch the PC. And for me, that was transformational, right? The whole idea that you could have arithmetic logic units and be able to bring it around, right? And now I basically live online, as most of us do, with the expectation that technology will be there to meet us. But one of the things I've always been fascinated by is the concept that we can have secure communication, and we can move things like money, trillions of dollars. I used to be in the banking world. We could do that all day long and it would all work. And growing up in the old compute model of SNA protocol, system network architecture, you were used to having copper, a logical unit, and then, a dynamic IP was really at the center core. And yet we're running our lives on an IP unprotected, unshielded world, which means we're taking a giant leap that somehow we're going to have enough intelligence to protect these communications and transmissions. And I see it in every conversation I have in boards these days. It's everything. How fast can you move forward? But then how can you make sure that what you're doing is safe and protected?
Yeah, and I think, Don, you mentioned a couple of emerging tech that we've all experienced over the years, mainframe to distributed, web 1.0, mobile, the internet. I was at a bank when we first connected that organization to the internet, and there was some interesting kind of security challenges, but there were actually a lot more organizational consequences than I think perhaps we'd anticipated at the outset. And we certainly see, more recently with the advent of outsourcing of core systems like ERPs and customer support platforms to third parties. These things actually have quite strong ripple effects through the organization, right? Because they're not just tech at that point, they're actually getting at the heart of the business and how it operates. So how have you and the boards you've been on in the past sort of worked to try and fully understand, to the extent you can, the potential for these technologies that, by definition, go beyond just technical impact?
Yeah, well, Nick, you said something really important, that the business goes beyond the tech. And I think, where the world is right now is a blur. I don't know any business that is not, completely integrated with technology in terms of its capabilities. So you do ERPs, or if I'm using Workday on my Apple device, I need to make sure that what I'm doing, the evaluations of people, or how I'm making payroll in line, doing payroll at an airport, that it's extremely secure. So I think every board needs to make itself comfortable that it understands how this is being done. To be more precise, I'm on quite a few boards. I'm on public boards, New York Stock Exchange listed boards. I'm on advisory boards and private equity boards, and I'm on charitable boards. And I'll say in a charitable board that I work on, Columbia University Teachers College, which this last week has been in the news every day. It's really important that we make sure that everything we're doing is extremely well protected. And it doesn't mean just because it's in a university setting or it's in a banking environment where I'm on a bank board, to me, they're the same thing. We're protecting really important information that is being used to be brought forward for decisions. And those decisions have high impact and high consequence to individuals. So I think the burden is on the board to assure that to the shareholders or to the community they serve.
Well, yeah, that's a good segue to something else I was going to ask you about. The burden is on the board. You're obviously a key player in the boards that you're on because of your expertise and your background and knowledge in this space. But as we've seen for various reasons, the board as a whole needs to have a reasonably good understanding of and the right levels of expertise around emerging technologies, the impacts to the business, how it's going to change the risk profile and so on. How do you think about the way in which boards can build that expertise over time to get, enough boards to the right level of expertise?
It's a great question. My quick answer would be diversity. I've always been a huge fan that you want to diversify out your boards. If everyone looks like the person next to you, you've probably done something wrong. I happen to think that age diversity is the one people don't talk about. And so I've been pushing on the boards I'm on to get young, youthful talent involved because they're going to give you a different perspective where possible. But one of the things that we've been putting a thumb on the scale is around tech and literally around cyber to make sure that we can bring in certified technologists to really know the cyber world. The second side to that equation is on training. You asked, how do you get the boards up there? Because the board is what it is. And it's a slow process of when the different classes of board members turn over. So people need to start doing their investments. And I wouldn't think let's say you didn't understand derivatives or the capital markets, I wouldn't think that you would be on the board without studying up on understanding the financial side, particularly if you're going to be thoughtful involved in a conversation of buyback. If I'm in a buyback for a public company, what is that doing for the shareholders? What is it doing in terms of limiting the capability of reinvesting in the business? What is it signaling in terms of dilution and so forth? If you didn't know that, then I would have expected you would have been getting a mentor, a tutor, or taking classes in it. I think the reverse is true on the cyber side and the technology. If you don't understand effective threat management and understanding, how to deal with crisis and what is the right terms that are involved here, then you need to invest. I will say a company that I'm really impressed with is Diligent, who most of us use to put our board books on, offers a lot of tutorials where you can click in and you can join into seminars with, great people talking about what needs to be done, and they can bring you up to speed there. So I'm encouraged that people are getting there. Most of the boards I'm on I'm seeing the investment of people having those conversations. I will say if it gets, someone starts asking a question about quantum, you will see a few eyes glaze over.
That's possibly a little bit of a stretch at this point for most of us, isn't it? So,
yeah. So, Don, I want to pick up on something you mentioned around kind of the threats and also the potential for incidents, because I think that, disruption really isn't a future possibility anymore. It's a reality now. Organizations are constantly being impacted by some type of cyber disruption out there. And you can think back just Log4j or even CrowdStrike more recently. Everybody knew where they were when the CrowdStrike incident occurred. But I'm just curious, from a board level perspective, what are some of the discussions that you've had to help proactively build organizations' agility so that they're able to kind of deal with some of those incidents when they occur?
Well, first up, I've been through it live. I've been in an organization, and I obviously can't say which one, but I can remember I was pulling into a Stop and Shop parking lot, August, picking up burgers to bring home to the kids for the grill. And I get this call, and it's like, this is it. This is not a drill. And I was like, oh my God. And next thing you know, you're on the phone with the full board, and you're on the phone with the outside attorneys, and you're out there, and someone is saying, who's taking charge? So very quickly, just like you would if you were dropped into a situation room, you need to sort that out. Now, for that particular board, I was chair of the technology, in fact, still am chair of the technology committee. And I was just so impressed with the way that we went into triage, that we were able to understand what part of the attack was going on, where the vulnerabilities were, what we were able to do to vary that offline, what the impact was going to be on it. And the fact that we had all of the senior management, the entire executive committee, the entire board, and we were getting these updates, and we said, okay, this is it. Let's break and let's take 2 hours off and come back on again. Right. And so all of a sudden, the board members who thought about this as something you would ask an open question about became dialed in to say, no, this is really real. Now, luckily, in my career, I'd managed enough of this that I knew exactly how to move into, go mode. And I would say one of the things boards might want to consider is to make sure who was ever sitting in that chair of the technology that they be seasoned. In other words, they've gone through a little of this before. So that I know it's a long answer, but it's a really important topic.
Yeah, no, it's great. I'm just curious too, as a follow-up to it, do you or have you participated in tabletop exercises ahead of time, sort of to build that muscle memory up around?
Absolutely. First off, I strongly believe those are the right things to do. One of the, just to talk a little bit about my history when I was at Citi, one of the things I did is I obviously had cyber reporting to me. I had technology, shared services operation. And I went out and I said, I really need to get the best cyber person in the world. I ended up hiring the chief operating officer from the FBI, a guy named Tom Harrington. And Tom Harrington would then be able to give me a threat analysis of what is going on across 5 eyes, if you know what those are different allies that give us intelligence, which is a very broad topic. But I would then take that in and we would then develop plausible issues of what's going on, for example, in Southeast Asia. And what does that mean to our business? And then we would bring them into the board and run scenarios and say, if you have to turn off a business, what does that mean overall? What is the client impact? What is the impact to the payment systems around the world and so forth? I can tell you now on the boards I sit on, we are big fans of tabletops. I like them being run by someone outside the organization because I think that's helpful. One in particular I like is an Israeli company, but I'll leave the names out.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's really important to have that practice, that experience doing exercises, so when the incident happens, you're ready.
Yeah, I agree, indeed. So I think, we've been talking for over 10 minutes now, and we haven't actually talked about AI, which must be something of a record at the moment. It's obviously the technology at the moment, Don, and, everyone's talking about it. And you mentioned earlier, the board's role in overseeing things and the need for the board to invest in building expertise. And this is just the next sort of iteration of that, right? But, as things are today, what do you see as the board's role in overseeing, responsible use of AI and ethical development of AI systems?
Yeah, Nick, I think the board's responsibility around AI is can be brought more broadly defined than responsible use of AI. I think it's to make sure that every organization is recognizing that this is a disruptive technology, AI, Gen AI, and they need to reimagine their strategy against a new wallpaper of where the world has moved so quickly. And I say quickly because we know that AI, the term was coined up in Dartmouth in May of 1956. So AI has been coming for a very long time. But what's really happened in the last 4 years is it's economically been able to come forward, right? Because the technology has brought us forward. So it seems so sudden when it burst on the scene. Not sudden for a company like Google, where it's really, I would say it's AI forward and AI first, AI native. But it's been a real wake-up call for us as we've seen it come out, and now we have it on all of our devices, and I've become somewhat dependent on it. Every company I work with around the world, we are thinking about how do you capture the value creation opportunity from AI? And we really are looking at that as then what do you need to do differently? But then across that is then this backdrop of ethical AI. And it's really a fascinating topic. And I'm going to quote your president and chief investment officer, Ruth Porat, who was an old partner of mine, not old, by the way, but ex-partner of mine. We were partners together at Morgan Stanley. And I always loved it. She would say in these meetings, if you give your point of view, it's worth an extra 10 IQ points. And what I love about Ruth is she's always got that extra point of view. But she was asked a question the other day about where Google is, where it stands in AI. And why isn't it even further ahead than it appears in the popular press? And her answer was, because we have to be so responsible. We have a standard that everyone expects of us. And she said, if a mother is up at 3 a.m. taking care of a sick child, she wants to know what the proper dose is for the Tylenol at that point. She can't guess. And Google can't guess. So the answer has to be served up and it has to be accurate, which means the levels of responsibility across the organization have to be that high. And I think she's right. We need to almost hold ourselves to a medical ethics standard, which is the highest standards that we hold ourselves to. My wife happens to be an ethicist, and she went to divinity school, so she's got a religious component to it. I think you need an order, not necessarily religious, but you need to go way up in the stack to say what is the right way in which we should be operating, and how do we make sure that whoever's using this AI, that it's responsible and it's going to cause no harm.
Yeah. Like a lot of, other emerging technologies that have emerged over the prior years, the board's job is to kind of juggle both, applying the brakes appropriately, but also, encouraging the use of the accelerator, isn't it?
So Don, when you think about that, like technology, and we talked about AI, you mentioned actually quantum as well. I'm just thinking about, how do you facilitate some effective communication between the technical teams that are doing some of this and then the actual executive leadership regarding meeting kind of the business objectives for an organization?
Yeah, for so long, the technical team was very comfortable hanging around technical topics, and the business was very and never the two should meet.
Right.
And that, what I did back when I was working full time was, worked on forming digital innovation teams where everyone would come together. Now I think that's almost an old fashioned idea. I don't think you're going to drive innovation without the two teams coming together. So they're merging. In fact, I put the point forward to one of our board members at Citi, who happened to be the dean of NYU. And I said, you're teaching business incorrectly. You should be teaching business aligned with tech so you can do this. And he actually formed a new school there, the NYU Tech College, followed by Cornell Tech out in the Innovation Center at Roosevelt Island. And so there's two examples of that just here on the East Coast. And I think it's fascinating because you're going to have to start at the root level, people coming together so that the people leaving with business degrees have high opportunities to know where the technology possibility is. It's interesting. I heard a speaker from Harvard Business School on Sunday night. His name happens to be Arthur Brooks, and he was talking about innovation and how innovation is really at its highest, almost through his math, at the same level it is for professional athletes. Right. So how long can you play? How long could Federer last on the court? By the way, a hell of a lot longer than I thought he'd last, and he's still phenomenal. But you want the young part of management really stirring things up, and you want them pushing you on the technology front. And then that challenge becomes one that needs to be welcomed by those who are in there who really control the capital, right? Because most of business is about capital allocation. So you have to make sure that these great ideas can then be allocated, and you get that balance of the two.
Yeah. So I feel like Nick and I could talk to you for hours about this, but we're getting towards the end of time. So I want to ask you one more question, and I call it the mic drop moment, which is, for all of the board members that are listening to our discussion today, what's that one action item that they should take away from this?
That is a drop the mic. I'm going to answer it with two answers. One, refer back to what I said before, educate yourself. If you're not putting yourself into classes on a regular basis, then you're a lot smarter than I am, and I'm sure you are. But, dial up Coursera, take a class on AI, and a good one, and take it for 8 weeks. That's what I do. And then I stick it in a corner of my life. And if I'm stuck at an airport, it's more time for me to put on the headphones and go to school. So number one is educate yourself as much as you can. And then number two, and I don't mean this to be, too promotional, is make sure you know who your partners are. Pick your partners, right? There's an old M&A line saying, pick your partners, right? You don't want to be having a partner like Google, that has grown up as AI native and has to keep the entire, cortex safe. And it does that for a living. I feel as if I have a partner like that and I have a bad day, I have a phone call that I can make. I happened to be at a Google dinner and I talked to the head of a very large online commerce company, and I was saying, why do you pick Google? And he said, because I have the leadership cell phone on my auto dial. And if something goes wrong, I feel I know how I'm going to get it fixed. And that's, as a board member, I would try to make sure that your executive management team has that same level of confidence that this leader does. So anyway, thank you so much for having me. I hope I haven't gone on too long.
No, it was great. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today on the Cyber Savvy Boardroom.
Thanks, Don.
Take care.